Well, this is wonderful to see a great assortment of people joining us this morning, especially coming up to the holiday break. So thank you to everybody out there. And I see a few more joining in. And for everybody who's entering the Zoom room, we are recording and we're also dictating. So that way we can produce some materials to share with you in case your colleagues weren't able to join us and you want to share with your teams after the fact. So I guess we will officially kick it off. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Joni Kinwell-Moore, and I'm the founder of Snacktivist Foods and also involved with the Civic Montana Project, which is a value chain project for opportunity crops in the Northern Rockies, Proso Millet being one of our focus crops. And so we here at NAMA today, North American Millets Alliance, are joined by Gary Wietgrefe, who, if you don't know, has formally joined our team. So yay, we're very excited because Gary, I don't think we've had a formal Zoom call since you've been officially part of the team. So I think kicking it off, it would be fair for you to give a brief introduction. And then Dr. Don Osborne, one of our original founders, is here with us today as well. And so we're going to be covering our proposal that Gary has been working on to create some Proso Millet grading standards, which will help advance the industry for Proso Millet and give it some guidance and consistency across the markets in the United States. As somebody who's been working in the millets industry for a decade now, especially on the consumer side as a purchaser, it has been frustrating sometimes the lack of consistency that I've experienced in both culinary quality, understanding what the germplasm is, and then grading standards across the industry. So we're really thrilled to have Gary joining the NAMA team. I think it would be fantastic, Gary, for you to give a brief introduction because your background really lends itself well to the expertise needed to guide a project like this. So Gary, take it away, please.
All right, thank you. And I will ask that if anybody has questions during the presentation, let me start out that way because there are going to be questions. Please bring it up. And these standards can be adjusted and should be adjusted based on the needs of the industry. And so as far as background, I'm going to have, I think it's slide 2, where I will actually show my background. But just so everybody is aware, I've been retired for 12 years, but I've been involved in the millet business for basically my life. Back in the 1950s and 60s, my dad, we live, by the way, our farm is on a glaciated plain in northern central South Dakota, very, very flat ground. And in the spring, we get rains and we couldn't plant small grains, primarily in low spots. And so when you couldn't plant any of the spring grains and finished up with corn, we would plant millet in the low spots, either for feed or for grain. And then millet being the shortest season crop, we could harvest then after the other crops were pulled off. And, sloughs might make up 10–15% of our fields. And then on my own, the first time I actually planted millet on my own was 1980. I'd had a crop failure the year before and a lot of things going on. And so I put forage millet in and basically it was harvested the month after my father passed away. And so it was a combination of things that my mother was on the farm and it provided great forage for her. And I mentioned it in one of my books on Proso Millet that there's a lot of personal background stories that help document what's actually going on in the millet industry historically. And so I'll try to cover that today. Should we move on unless there's some questions? Okay, I'm going to share screen and pull it up. All right, I assume everybody is seeing this screen of grading Proso Millet.
I can't see it.
You cannot see it.
Yeah.
All right, I didn't share it apparently.
Try that again.
All right. Share. Okay. Now is it shared?
The screen is shared. We don't see the.
Yep.
There you go.
You're good now.
Okay. All right. Now, hopefully the whole thing is being shared. You can see the whole slide. Grading Proso Millet for grain for all markets.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. So you'll see on this slide, this is a grain handling system that I was I helped start in 1980, and it obviously expanded since then, but we had 252,000 bushel tanks. Two of these tanks are prepared or have Proso millet floors in them so we could blow air through them. So we would hold up to 15, 16 million pounds in these two tanks. And in fact, when we were full, we ended up putting Proso on the ground, millions of pounds on the ground. And I would not recommend it because it spreads out. Corn piles up, but millet spreads out. And so I've been actively involved in the millet trading business since 1980. Excuse me, since 1990. And before that, in the late 70s, early 80s, I had I worked for the Department of Agriculture and became the millet guy there. And we started this. And then 1990, I started my own millet seed company and hulling business and things like that. And so later on, I've written 2 books. I did some research in Mongolia and Turkey, reintroduced these crops after the Soviet Union collapse in Mongolia, reintroduced Proso millet into Mongolia and worked with them for a number of years and 15 years with Uludağ University in Bursa, Turkey. And so that's just some general background. I'm a internationally certified agronomist, and through that facility there that I showed you developed in the 80s, I was a USDA licensed grain grader, and the primary background for these standards are twofold. One is the U.S. grain industry standards, and number 2 is the 1954 Proso millet grading standards that was developed by the developed by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And if some of you are not aware of it, Proso millet was actually actively traded on the floor of the Minneapolis Grain Exchange. When rail cars, it was mostly came in by rail, but there were some trucks that came in, they would actually have grain samples on the floor, whether barley, wheat, spring wheat, winter wheat, Proso millet, pans of it would come in from the different loads, and most of it was box cars. And so the first time I was on the floor of the Minneapolis Grain Exchange, I was 16 years old, and it was an interesting way of trading. Well, those standards were phased out because grain was no longer traded that way. But when I took a trade group to Rotterdam, I did a USDA trade group to Europe back in 1981, and we went to the Rotterdam Grain Exchange. And on the Rotterdam Grain Exchange, they had trading just like they did in Minneapolis, just buckets of Proso millet. Actually, they had 3 grades, buckets of Proso millet sitting on tables at the Rotterdam Grain Exchange. The 3 Proso millets there were Argentine yellow plata, and plata in Spanish is silver, so it's a gray type millet, but this was more of a yellow version of it, which Proso comes in lots of different colors. And for our interest, it was Colorado white Proso and Dakota white Proso. I go, they're the same varieties developed by the University of Nebraska and some from Colorado, other places, but it's the same. Why do they call it 2 different things? It was explained to me that Colorado white Proso has a brighter color. So no matter where the millet came from, it was traded at Rotterdam. If it was a clean, bright white Proso, it was traded as Colorado white. If it had some slight to severe, and I only seen slight weather damage, because the Dakotas tend to get some rains during August, September, and millet can basically fade out a little bit in the windrow, and therefore Rotterdam called it Dakota white. And so sometimes Dakota, South Dakota, North Dakota were producing a Colorado white Proso. Sometimes they were producing Dakota white Proso. But that just gives you some background into how the the standards kind of were active years ago. Now let's move on. These standards, you'll see there's going to be one slide that accounts for about 90% of the information. And they basically, what I'm going to cover here of the 6 pages of standards are the grades and the standards. So the standards will include actually defining it, what are the grade requirements, the mechanical process, things like that. Okay, a little more background. Why do we need standards? You can read the slide, but basically USDA, even though 20 states in 2024 produced Proso millet, at least 20 states that I can document, produced Proso millet, the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service only reports Proso produced in Colorado, Nebraska, and South Dakota. The last 25-year average, 460,000 acres have been harvested, equivalent to about 57 million bushels, 700 million, roughly 700 million pounds, with no grading standards. And Proso, as I mentioned, is produced in a number of states. In 2017, the most documented census is 2017 every 5 years in 2022. And this is a breakdown of the states, according to US Census, and the number of producers actually contacting and reporting production of Proso millet. And you can see the states there, but and the number of farmers. And you can see why USDA would have selected Colorado, Nebraska, and South Dakota as the 3 leading states. But there are other states that produce significant quantities of millet. And believe me, there are a number of farmers that, in these states that far exceed what the census data picks up. But one more statistic I'll throw out there. About 52% of the recorded, I'll say, survey data from government sources, 52% is Proso acres. There are 972,000, if I remember the number right, 972,000 acres of millets planted in the US, according to the Farm Service Agency. That includes Japanese, pearl, foxtail, teff, Proso, and common. The problem with USDA's gathering of data from FSA, they can only write down and claim acreage based on what the farmers call their millet. So, for example, common millet in Georgia would be pearl millet. They plant it for forage, some for grain, but mainly for forage. The same, say another producer in north central South Dakota might produce foxtail millet, and to him, that's common millet, so foxtail millet becomes common. In worldwide, historically, over the thousands of years, Proso is common millet. So the Farm Service Agency has a heck of a time trying to identify which millets belong in which categories because there's different names. And so part of the North American Millets Alliance is we promote all millets, and we primarily, if you're looking at a grain, would be looking at grain millet, meaning Proso millet, okay? I'll move on more quickly. So USDA has standards for 12 grains. Canada has standards for 21 grains. There are the sources. And by the way, this screen and some other ones are shared on a YouTube video, 4-minute YouTube video that I developed summarizing these standards. So first you have to have a definition. Proso is defined, and you can read it, but it's before the removal of dockage. This is critical because all grains are stored bulk in bins before they are cleaned. And so to make a grain fungible, meaning interchangeable, they have to test it before the removal of dockage. And obviously, you don't want other grains mixed in there, so there's standards on that. So that's the basic definition. So within the definition, you have standards, And you have classes, and this goes for wheat and corn and other things. But millet classes will be white. And by the way, that includes creamy, because there's off colors of breeds, varieties of white Proso that are somewhat creamy. Red, mixed, meaning 2 or more colors, and other. And there are black Proso millets, they're gray, there's Argentine silver, yellow plata, pure yellow, many, many different colors of Proso millet. Within those classes, there are 2 subclasses, regular and glutinous. And please, for those that are not too familiar with glutens in grain, millet, especially Proso, what we're talking about here, does not contain the amylose protein gluten. So even though it's called glutinous millet, that is the term for, I'll just call it sticky. In corn, they call it waxy. There's waxy or sticky rice. There's waxy or sticky corn. And it has properties, those subclasses have to be kept separately, and it's defined in the standards, but they need to be kept separate so that you can use the glutinous aspects of it. And why do people making ketchup and lots of different condiments and different sauces and gravies use gluten? My wife cannot digest gluten, and so she has to avoid these kind of products. And so to avoid confusion, let's not get confused that millet is a non-glutinous grain, but gluten is used for binding agents to make the flowability of agents much better. And so what some industry groups are now starting to look at is using gluten-free products, the glutinous version of it, meaning glutinous rice, glutinous millet, into those mixes to replace gluten from wheat. And so there's lots of markets, potential markets opening up for regular white Proso in snack foods and grains and things like edible, ethanol, poultry diets, etc. But the biggest market appears to be in food potential, minor uses. But when you start adding the glutinous millets into other millets, into other foods, it'll expand the market, I think, significantly, and we need standards for those. So here's a sample of millet. You can see that there's damage, defects, dockage, foreign material. It might be heat damaged. Who knows? I don't see any other grains in there, but I'll cover those. Is that food grade millet that you're looking at? I would say certainly not. If I was in the snack food business, I wouldn't buy it, and I wouldn't buy it from somebody that purchased it from the farmer. So let's look at the basic grain standards, and they're here on this page. And this is what I said, about 90% of what you're going to use as far as standards are going to be on this page. So if you want to take a screenshot of it or whatever, this is going to be the data that most buyers will use on a daily basis. So let's look at it in more detail. I have the sample on the side, on your left side, and this sample tested 51 test weight and 14% moisture. Anybody tell me what grade it is? 1, 2, 3 sample grade. Any guesses? Well, let's go to the next slide. Oops, I heard somebody was going to answer.
Number 3, I think.
All right.
Thinking too, yeah.
Sample.
All right. Oh, yeah, that's one way of making sure everybody's still there. All right. Anyway, it has test weight of 51, 14% moisture. But look at the other definitions within the standards that I put together. You have kernel damage. Looks low quality. Certainly a lot of dockage. If you look at the standards, it can't be number 2 because it's got some, it can't be 1 because it's got some weather damage. It looks severely weather damaged, so that means it's no higher than 3. And stones and dirt, there's definitions, doesn't matter what grain, and millet, I have it in there. They can't have more than 2% of stones or dirt clods in your sample. So that obviously is present in here. And keep in mind, when test weight is measured, it's measured with the dockage in there. And so you can see stems, leaves, whatever is in there, including hulls, would be considered dockage and therefore lower the test weight. Okay, let's look at another sample. This is obviously a much higher quality sample that came in from the combine. It's 56.5 pound test weight, 14% moisture. What grade would you put this in?
1.
Why?
It's cleaner. Test weight's over 56.
Huh?
Dockage
Yeah.
looks low.
Looks low. Yeah. Yeah. Good. But do you have enough information to grade that?
Probably not.
Okay, let's go into that. This is actually a sample that I got in, what year did they get this? 20 years ago or so. I got a sample from Nebraska that developed Plateau, the waxy, glutinous, or sticky millet. This is that sample. And I pulled it out to take this photo for this presentation. And so this is the reason why we have to have standards, and we have to have trained people that can reference those standards. And so the farmer needs to know that he's producing a Plateau if he's going to try to go to a food grade glutinous or sticky market with this product. Okay. Now it may look exactly like a white Proso, regular white Proso. And in that case, Joe, you're correct that it is low dockage. It does have heavy test weight. It is under 15% moisture, which if it's over 15% moisture, the standards as they're written, it would throw it into sample grade. But that doesn't mean that an elevator can't mix either this Plateau or the last sample in the same tank. Obviously, there's reasons why you wouldn't want to. If you only have one out of, say, 8 grain tanks at your elevator for grains, you only want to have one designated for Proso. And so you have to have restrictions of what you want to buy and what discounts you apply. Now, anybody in the grain business knows that you're going to have moistures coming in a wide range. If the grain had been laying in a windrow like Proso, it might come in at 16% moisture. But if your tank is running, say, 11, 12, 13% moisture on average, you can stick in a 15, 16% moisture Proso, blends extremely well. You're going to have to, give a discount to the grower because you're buying moisture you're not going to capture. And so there's a discount applied to moisture over 15%. But that, again, is totally up to the grain buyer, as is how you segregate them. And if I was in the grain business like I was with 252,000 bushel tanks, holding, say, 8-9 million pounds each, you want to make darn sure what you're putting in each one is fairly uniform. Okay, so because that was glutinous, a Plateau variety of millet, it should be graded as white, subclass glutinous, and a grade of number 1, as Joe pointed out. Okay, white, glutinous, grade number 1. Now, most Proso will fit in as common white Proso. So let's back that up. Between 53 and 56 pound test weight is where most white Proso comes in from the field. And so just like number 2 yellow corn, you'd hardly ever hear of grading number 1 yellow corn. It's sold internationally as number 2 yellow corn, even though there's other grades. Proso the same way. Proso is going to be sold mainly as a number 2 white Proso. Now, keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, there are red Prosos. Cerise is the main variety still produced the last 35 years or so. Cerise is a beautiful red Proso. That's obviously a separate grade, a separate class, excuse me, separate class of Proso. And again, we are part of the North American Millet Alliance. The most cerise or the most red Proso that I'm aware of produced in a concentrated area is actually south of Winnipeg in Manitoba, Canada. And so they could use these standards if they wanted to. Okay, white Proso. Does a licensed buyer, brought it up before, does a licensed buyer have to buy or price Proso millet based on USDA standards? USDA doesn't have standards right now, but if they adopted our standards, do you as a buyer have to buy it that way? And can a farmer say, you have to buy my millet? The answer is no. No. A buyer can decide based on these standards or any individual standards they have. For example, Joni runs a snack food business. There are certain millets and samples that she is exposed to, as she mentioned at the beginning of this talk, that she just will not buy, and she shouldn't have to buy it or price it. Regular grain buyers, especially truckers, they need to be careful because a birdseed buyer would be very, very reluctant to buy that very dirty, weathered sample because he would have to, or she would have to really blend it with very good millets in order to make it palatable for the birdseed buyer in a package, meaning that the birds don't buy it, the birdseed buyers buy it, and eventually dump it into a bird feeder. And so that's where about 2/3 of the US millet goes right now. And that is going to change significantly as their standards become available and as more and more Proso is used.
Hey, Gary.
Maybe I should, yes, please.
Sorry, I got a question. This is Joe Doyle with Bay State Milling.
Yes.
And this is probably a stupid question, but
No question is stupid because we're all learning on this deal.
so are you telling me that the producer is not binning based on grading his or her field after harvest?
They're binning based on the bins that they on our farm and my grandson's farm, where some years we might have 4, 5, or 6 different bins where it's put in. It's usually fairly standard quality because most of it's harvested within a week or 10 days. And so most of it comes in looking the same way, sometimes 1 or 2 different, 3 different varieties. But most farmers do not bin it based on grade.
Okay, so we're just basically buying it as is.
You are. That's what I did when I was in the grain business.
Okay.
And that's why I think it's very important, whether you're Bay State or anybody, you want to you have your own standards. You obviously been buying for a long time. You have your own standards, but does the grower know what those standards are? Especially if it's a new grower, maybe wanting to sell to you.
Yeah. So my team just helped me out. They're like, we do have our own grade. So I guess we're buying it on that way. So
Sure. Yeah. And every buyer would, but there's no consistency between buyers. And I'm not saying Bay State has to use these, but if we're going to develop an industry, a grain industry, I mean, any product I mentioned at the beginning of this call, maybe before a lot of you joined, if you go buy a hamburger, you want to know that it's a McDonald's hamburger, not from some Joe Blow that slapped a couple balls together and ground his own meat. You have to have some kind of standards, and there's expectations when you release a grain to the market, and part of those are based on USDA regulations or in the case of Canada agriculture regulations. And so we want to have some uniformity, and there was. But why did I modify the 1954 Minnesota Department of Ag standards? For example, the average test weight is higher now. Why? Because Proso hulls are part of the dockage. And that's why you use, and I'll show you in a second, a dockage tester. The dockage tester will blow out the hulls based on the air. But like when I was a kid, we threshed millet, we threshed oats and wheat. And on the thresh machine, you couldn't set the fan very high. It was set mainly to blow the straw into a pile out the back of the thresh machine. Well, that is what was used to develop the Minnesota grain standards. We use combines now for 100% of the Proso. Therefore, we have to assume the millet is coming in at a higher test weight because it is separating much better separation on modern combines than any thresh machine could do. So here's the mechanical threshing, and these are in the standards, and you'll see the 2.11, 2.12, etc. But the basic Carter dockage tester, which Bay State or others probably use, elevators use it. That's what I used, and it shows how to separate and the sieves that you should put in there. And again, but you can hand test, by the way. You can hand test the test weight and the moisture. And a simple moisture tester would be obviously adequate. Okay. Keep in mind that these standards have not been adopted by USDA, but I am in the beginning stages of trying to figure out where to go within USDA to get them changed. Keep in mind that the last time the Agricultural Marketing Service Handbook, Federal Grain Inspection Service Handbook was changed was July 30th, 2013. And the U.S. grain standards, the last time they were changed, according to, this is about 3 weeks ago, was September of 2007. Now, there's a farm bill out. The farm bill has not passed. As of yesterday, they said it's about a 34% chance of passing this year. I went through that 952 pages, and there looks to be about 45 different areas that millets, not only Proso, but millets could fit within the USDA, we'll say 2025 farm bill if they get it passed. But that doesn't mean that other farm bills don't have programs that could be utilized for millet. What we're doing here is trying to develop a standard so that it will be a part of the USDA grades, so that when farmers are asked, what are you planting for FSA, they know the answer. And I'm working on that part as a separate program. But the grades, when you trade millet, it'll be traded on these grades and accepted. These grades, there are modifications. For example, biotech products have standards, I'll call them sub-standards within these USDA handbooks. And so they are modified over time, and that gives me hope that we can get Proso into those fairly rapidly. So I'm certainly open for more questions, but I do want to announce that this is summarized in a 4-minute, 20-second YouTube video. I think it's my 10th, 11th, 12th YouTube video in the last 2 years that I put out on producing millet, planting millet, harvesting millet, when to harvest, use of millets, forage millets, things like that. But there's a grading Proso millet YouTube video that summarizes this in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. And I really encourage you or anybody that you are working with, whether it be growers or buyers, that you quickly review that 4-minute video, and it'll really help you. Now, as far as standards, where they are going to be available, they're going to be available on the new North American Millet Alliance website. I think that is this page. It's going to be milletsalliance.org, O-R-G. That's millets, plural, milletsalliance.org. That website will be coming up online fairly quickly. There's a milletsalliance.com that is currently up, and to try to keep things uniform, we're going to transition everything to milletsalliance.org. But for any of you on this call, whether you've been on the collaboration calls over the last year or so, or want to look for millet information, we hope to have this website an interactive website with lots of information, including these standards, including forage millets, fonio, teff, pearl, Japanese, lots of different millets out there. And let me close by saying that in my estimates, there are between 2.5 and 3 million acres of millets planted in the US. According to Farm Service Agency, 2024, there are 972,000 acres of millet planted. But that does not include a lot of ranchers that plant pearl, foxtail, and other millets, teff, for forage and don't report to FSA. It includes no millets in cover crops. And I would estimate that a 25 to 30% of cover crops have some millet, maybe a few millet, pound or so of millet in there. It, for the most part, does not cover wildlife use, meaning that game farms plant millet in Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, all the way into the Dakotas and Montana, and them aren't recorded by FSA. So that's where millions of acres of millet exist in the US are not reported. If we take those, excluding sorghum, which is a separate, large seeded millet, excluding sorghum, I estimate that of all millets, proper millets in the US, equal the 4th or the 5th leading grain produced in the US. It would be ahead of the crops like oats, barley, rye, flax, peanuts, sugar beets, etc. When you add in sorghum, without a doubt, sorghum and the millets are the 4th leading grain produced in the US. 4th leading crop planted, not grain, crop planted in the US behind corn, number 1, soybeans, number 2, and wheat, number 3. Then the millets and sorghum combined. Very significant, and that's our argument by going to USDA and saying we need to start having standard grains. We need to standardize terms as far as what are millets and what do farmers and agencies call them. Questions?
Gary, before the questions come, I wanted just to quickly mention about the website. Yeah, we do have the milletsalliance.com. That's kind of off Google search turned off site just for experimenting with a few things. But yeah, yep. the .org site is what we're using. You'll notice that in our email addresses. At least some of us have a milletsalliance.org email. Anyway, that's what's going on with that.
Okay, thank you, Don. And we're estimating, and I'm on the board of directors now of the North American Millets Alliance, and we're hoping that the beginning of the year we will incorporate and obviously have the website and everything up. But in the short term, please feel free to use that Proso Millet grading. One way that people get into my YouTube channel is just, and I have different YouTube videos on there from my bike trip to Alaska and things like that. But if you just put in Wietgrefe millets, it'll bring out the channel that I have designated for millets, and within that list you'll find the grading standards. I try to keep them all around 4 minutes.
I put that in the chat if anybody wants to look at that.
Okay, thank you, Don.
Easy to access.
Okay, I'm going to back out of this.
Thank you, Gary. This is really
full screen.
It's been very, very informative and absolutely wonderful initiative on several levels. Beginning with the obvious one of getting standards for increasing marketing with Proso Millet, but also the ripple effects, I would guess, with other grains, among them other millets and other so-called alternative crops that are gaining more interest and more market and deserve to be have a consistent and predictable standards to work with.
Well, Don, you bring up an issue that I didn't cover, and I apologize, that a lot of grains, a lot of millets are harvested for grain. There are Japanese millets harvested for grain, mainly it's used for seed. There are foxtail millets harvested for grain, mainly used for seed, planted for forage and in cover crops, but also put in foxtail millets are put in bird food for color, especially cage bird food. There are pearl millets produced for grain and used for food products. So why did I only make these standards for Proso? Because it would be extremely confusing if I tried to include all millets within the Proso grain, since 50, well, I'll say more than that. Of all the grain millet harvested in the US, about 90+% are Proso. Let's start out with one grain Proso having grain standards. If pearl, foxtail, Japanese, teff, fonio, finger millet, which we had some universities working on finger millet, if those millets get up to a level where they need grain marketing standards, I will be happy to work with that specific millet and make grain standards. At this point, they're too minor to, and it would be too confusing to bring any of those into the Proso grain standards with the 400 to 500,000 acres harvested every year. Is that clear?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you for clarifying that. These are indeed separate species, different grains, like there's different tastes to them. I kind of rotate between them. Sometimes if I want to get some variety in breakfast cereal or whatever cereal, I use different ones. But yeah, they're different, really different beasts. And the name kind of has us thinking about them as one thing. And that's useful in terms of action and research and discussion, but it can be confusing. So yeah, it's really, you got to start with where you are in terms of these standards, and where we are in the U.S. right now is that Proso Millet is the absolute main one under that name, marketed in this continent, really. So if you see millet in the stores, it's Proso Millet. Very rarely, there are a few brands like Eden Grains. They specify the species and so on, but that's really the exception.
Yes.
Yeah. So we'll hope that this gets more attention, and we'll see how this process goes. These are the questions.
Yes, please break in any time. This slide, you probably didn't catch it, but on the left-hand side is a slide photo that I took in Uganda. We have an orphan girl that we helped school in Uganda, and so we went over there a few years ago. And but in Uganda grocery stores, they sell a lot of millets, a lot of it mixed with soybean because they need some protein. They can't afford meats, and so it's mixed with soy to add protein to it. But their main millet is finger millet. Now they're just north of the equator, and so finger millet is more of a tropical or subtropical millet. And so you may see a different type of millet in an Asian or a specialty store, an Indian food store, for example, that may not be Proso. But if it's wheat, or excuse me, if it's beer, if it's bird food, if it's grains, if it's in hulled, red meal, hulled, it's Proso. It's Proso. Just assume that, as Don said, Proso millet is the source of millet in the U.S. for all foods.
Is what is sold in the markets here all grade 1, do you think?
No.
So if I go to the store and I buy I don't know, Bob's Red Mill or Eden or one of these other brands that has millet, but it's Proso millet, can I be sure that it would translate as a grade 1?
No, I can't say that because I've been out of the specific industry for some years, and I cannot document what they use. For example, I used to sell into the mushroom business, Proso millet in the mushroom business, and they had moisture requirements. For example, a minimum of 13% moisture, which a lot of buyers and a lot of sellers, for example, in the Panhandle, Nebraska, couldn't meet those standards because their millet was too dry. And so there are individual users that have standards. And when you take the hull off of Proso, it might look weather damaged. When you take the hull off, the weather damage, for the most part, unless it's severely weather damaged, the weather damage is on the outside. Just like on wheat, it will affect the protein level because nitrogen is leachable. I'll just call it that. And so if you have wheat that's spring wheat that was in a windrow and it got rained on, you can lose a couple % protein. That will happen with millet also. But when you remove the hull, easily to remove with a huller, forest bird hullers are the most common. You remove the hull, it looks good, like a bright, nice yellow grain to eat. It would be nice, Don, if all buyers in the US had a standard that they only buy number one, but unless somebody knows what number one is, how are they going to do it?
Yeah, and the lack of standards like this, I think, really prevents more adoption of manufacturing and branded partners, like to entering the space and really starting to innovate with millet. Especially as we start to look at germplasm that has certain characteristics for culinary or nutrition, etc. Like we just need to have a foundation for grading to start with.
Yeah, that was one of the kind of the points I was going to make is, with dryland genetics right now, we're working toward some kind of unique, what I would call output trait characteristics of millet varieties that aren't as standard as just typical millet. And if anybody's interested, I can go into that a lot deeper sometime, but and I think that would be covered more in an IP world than in this great, grain standards world. One of the things I've thought about here, Gary, is just, have you started to kind of discuss this with some of the bigger buyers, millet buyers? Like I'm thinking Perry Brothers or CHS, maybe Flagler Co-op, some of the guys who spend a lot of time and money. I was glad to see Bay State on the call today, just as an end user and purchaser of millet. I think there's value in trying to get to these standards. But I also think we need to make sure the industry is alongside us and supporting as well.
Without a doubt. There's no way. Yes, I have I talked to all of those? No, I haven't. And do they all buy based on their own standards? I talked to one buyer here a month and a half ago, and he says, yeah, we have individual standards. We have to, just like we buy any grain. And so we've had them this way for years. And so my guess is that it's fairly universal to use the old Minnesota standards. Where they're going to be different is the number one would have been 54-pound test weight, and they probably don't even have them. It's millet, they either rejected or accepted, and so or put into a separate tank. And so when you have, for example, a birdseed buyer a lot of times will buy based on a 3.5% or 3% or less dockage. So if your millet comes in, whether you're a trucker or an elevator, and it's way over 3%, you're probably not going to get it into a lot of birdseed buyers because they do have, I'll call it scalping equipment, but mainly they're blenders. And so they're looking for a fairly high quality millet going into the bag. That would be somewhat different if you're going to the poultry food or an ethanol plant. There's less care for that dockage. Sure, it's going to be discounted, dockage deducted, but the color and things like that aren't as critical. But Craig, yes, you're absolutely right. Not only I, but all of you talking with your industry components, whether it be Joni and your company and your producers, Craig with your seed, the people that buy seed from you, Joe with Bay State, bounce these standards off to see where and if they need change. I'm totally open to these being changed, and please contact me. Through my website. By the way, my regular website, I'm an author and I've got 10 books out and other things on my website. It's relatingtoancients.com, relatingtoancients.com. And that's where I link the videos, I link the audios that I do, I link my books and things like that. Yeah, my books are available on Amazon, my regular books, but by the way, I should mention my Proso Millet books, How to Produce Proso Millet and Proso Millet, a Trade Summary, are available for free. My link off the website, or you can get at researchgate.com. And so they came out in 1989 to 1990, and they're available for free. I still have hard copies of How to Produce Proso Millet that can be ordered from my website, but that one I don't sell on Amazon. I just make it available PDF for free. Researchgate.com. More questions.
So
We got a few
David
more-
Brenner had a good question.
Yes.
Just dig. Yeah. Oh, sorry, my internet is so unstable today. Sorry about the delay. But just talking about starch type and the purity of starch type and starch, like what if the starch is mixed is the question from David Brenner. And I think that would be a great topic to dig into a little bit.
Okay. Perfect. There are 6 pages of standards. And so, as I said, 90% of them were on this slide. 90% of them are going to be right there, what are referenced on a daily basis. But on starch type, the whole reason we have subclasses is because of starch type. And so without I don't know what page it's on. I read through it again this morning, but that would come under section. Would come under section 4, classes of Proso millet. And white is white creamy pericarp, as I told, red, Proso, etc. And then the subclasses would be the glutinous or regular. So within those, how they test those, I used to have at our elevator grain analyzer, and we tested spring wheat, winter wheat, etc. for different protein levels and bought based on protein. This was in South Dakota. But whether that type of machine can be calibrated for glutinous or waxing millets like Plateau, that I'm not sure of, but there is a need for identity preservation of the variety. Identity preserve. If you're buying Plateau and planning on selling it into the food market, you want to know what that is Plateau. And if you want to sell it other than regular, you need to have it in a separate tank. And those standards are in here. And as far as the percent, right offhand, I think it's one seed in 100 is allowed. One seed of regular in 100 of Plateau is allowed in these standards, and one seed in a yeah, I better not say that, because there's that's why I wanted to make sure that they're available on the website. Could you please share the 6-page document, because these are what is actually I use to do the basis on. So answer David's question. Yes, there is, but I don't know where it's at right offhand to read it. So sorry.
This is page 6 with the and section 4, the classes. The last page of the standards. I can move around if you'd like, but it's obviously going to be too much to read online in the last few
yeah. Oh, here it is. Yes, you're right. It's item 4, and then 4.1 obviously is white, but obvious before, there are 4 classes, white, red, mixed, and other, and 2 subclasses, regular and glutinous, of Proso millet, and must be harvested, transported, and stored separately, and shall not have more than 1 seed per 1,000 of a different class, or 1 seed per 100 within a different subclass. Okay, so that's where it was at. You could have 1 regular Proso in 100 seeds of plateau glutinous. Okay, you could have 1 red in 1,000 seeds of white and still be within grade. And by the way, red really shows up. I don't know if Dibach is on the call, but I believe it was Rise Proso millet developed around, I'll say 1990. There was some breeding foundation seed that had a little red pollen that got in, and so you will see a red off red seed in some of the common millets that are planted and replanted out there that are backgrounds of Rise, maybe even Sunup or one of those older varieties of Proso, but totally allowed. And by the way, when you remove the pericarp, the hull, it looks the same.
So, unless there are other questions, could I make a quick comment on the gluten and glutinous
Please.
topic? My understanding, I'm not a chemist or a botanist, but my understanding is that it's a short protein in the grain that makes them tend to be sticky when they're cooked, and that somehow people have found ways to breed that in different kinds of crops. So, and that's entirely different from gluten, which is, as I understand it, a fraction of wheat in particular. There are different kinds of gluten that is a problem for some people dietarily. But yeah, the sticky thing is really just a kind of a fluke that people have, I guess, stumbled on and they bred for. So you have entirely separate varieties. But
you're right on there. And by the way, it's sticky, whether it's corn, rice, or millet, are free of amylose. Amylose, the type of protein amylose. What makes it sticky is that they're virtually 100% amylopectin. Amylopectin. That is the sticky component in Proso. Now, just as far as just a bit of background, and I claim that millet was the most ancient of grains used around the world. And, it's claimed 10, 12,000 years ago in northern China. But there are sources, in fact, Plateau, the main variety released by, I think it was a collaboration between Colorado, Nebraska, and Wyoming, but Plateau was released about 20 some years ago as the first variety of glutinous or waxy millet in the US. But there are lots of different sources of glutinous millet. And Plateau was actually sourced from, or bred into the Chinese variety. There are, I think, around 6,700 glutinous rice varieties around the world, all sourced from one glutinous DNA identified gene, or identified source, meaning that Proso has more options to diversify, the way I understand it, glutinous, than does rice. The same modification occurred naturally in corn, and that was identified, I think, in the 1920s. And so it became a good food corn, was waxy corns. And the yields were offset by 2 or 3, something like that %, the last data I seen when I used to sell it. But we used to have the same variety of corn, number 2 yellow corn, sold as a waxy variety and as a standard hybrid. But not a whole lot of work had been put into developing the highest yielding waxes. It was bought because of the qualities, and that's also going to be the case with Proso. Plateau may not yield in Colorado or in South Dakota, North Dakota, the Carolinas, Kansas, wherever you produce Proso. Plateau may not yield as much, but you're not producing it for the highest yield. You're producing it for the best quality for your end use.
So Gary, I guess what are our next steps now? We're coming up to the hour point.
Yes.
A lot of people have to move on.
Yeah, and
Sure.
we are at the top of the hour. Yeah, and we are at the
Okay.
top of the hour, so I know some of you may need to run to another meeting, but we'll make sure that we follow up and send out a dictation from the AI and then also the recording. So if you want to review this at a later time or share, well, you'll have it in your inbox before the end of the year.
Okay, it'll be on the collaboration list. Don has agreed to share that. It will be on the website coming up. Please reference the YouTube video for beginning to share, and I will and others will be working with USDA to figure out how best to get these approved. And if there are changes or if there are objections, please bring it to the group through the collaboration list, Don, that you have been sharing the last year or so.
Okay, yeah, I'd be glad to do that. I think typically these things, if they're going to be adopted, there is a comment period, but we certainly would alert people to that. If it gets to that stage, we would be very happy.
Yes, there will be comments under the Federal Registry if it goes into if it's beginning to be published or accepted by USDA. You're correct.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Joni. And thank you, everybody.